certain terms seem to get overused, and the term legend, I think, gets overused. I do a lot of teaching, and you often hear the term being bounded around in schools. He or she is a legend of a teacher, and often it's just overused. And it's the same with cameras. Some people might say a certain camera, a Zenith, is a legend of a camera, and they might be right, but sometimes again it gets overused. But the camera I'm talking about today, I think, is a legend of the camera world, and it's the Olympus Trip. The Olympus Trip was first produced in 1967, and even in 1967 some people thought it was a little bit old-fashioned. It had this selenium meter. A selenium meter is based on a selenium cell, doesn't need any batteries, it reacts to light, and it can control the meter. And the great thing about this compact camera is it used no batteries, had this automatic meter which you basically point and pressed, and the camera cleverly chose an appropriate shutter speed and an appropriate aperture. It had a manual override for when you used flash. Had another clever thing with it. This was at a stage where a lot of compact cameras were using rangefinders, but rangefinders were always quite mechanical and could go wrong and were quite expensive to put in. The designers of the Trip came up with this ingenious thing of zones. You have a head for close-ups, you have a small group, a large group, and a mountain. And you can see all this in the viewfinder. So when you put the camera to your eye, you don't have to worry about any aperture, and all you do is match the appropriate zone for your situation. You just simply match the appropriate zone. So if you are in the countryside and doing a landscape, you put it in a landscape. If you've got a group, you've just put it on a group, and it is so easy. I remember back in the 1970s in my local area of Dorset, there was a great photographer on the local paper called Mr. Jones, and if you first met him he would seem quite grumpy. He always wore the same grey suit, he drove a little white Mini, and though he had OM1 and other good cameras, he always used an Olympus Trip. And I remember as a teenager speaking to him because I was in the local cine club, and for some reason I seemed to get in the paper a few times, and again he was great to talk to, which he wouldn't have thought at first meeting, but he was passionate about photography. And I remember asking him, why did you use the Trip? And he said, well, I can depend on it. He said, all I need to worry about is grouping people. I've got to get people in the right group. And if I got people in the right group, I can just point and shoot. And if I'm having to think about focusing too much and lenses and all the rest of it, it takes away from what I need to do. And I need to get to the next job. These photographers used to work incredibly hard and cover so many stories in one day. And I thought that was fascinating that he depended on his little Olympus Trip. His photographs, I believe, are now in the Dorset archive. So this camera sold itself in one sense because it was such a good camera to use. The results were very sharp. Plus, there was an enormous advertising campaign by David Bailey in the 1970s, which basically he used himself, who do you think you are, David Bailey? And it was. But he used this camera as part of the campaign, and it sold incredibly well. They continued to produce this camera, can you believe it, until 1984. So it had a really good long run. And if you think back in the 84, you were getting some very sophisticated automatic focusing cameras coming out at that point. But the Trip had had a really good life and had continued to be a popular camera. So, as I said, really easy to use. You have on the front you can choose your ASA, now called ISO, and you've only got the choices between 100, 200 and 400. Unfortunately, on this particular camera, this has become a little bit loose, and that can happen. I think the bearings sometimes dry up. But I've put a film for this and got some photographs that I will show you at the end of this video. A word about how to check that they are working, because the two things, well, there's three things you need to check. The first, I would say, is a very easy one that you can rectify yourself, and that is the seal here, the felt seal here. Like on a lot of 1960s and 70s, 80s cameras can perish, but you can replace that moderately easily. So that's the first thing to check. Second thing, as I said, is that this aperture, ISO ring can be loose, so check that. And the third, and probably the most important thing to check, and the thing that unfortunately you can't repair easily, is whether the selenium meter is still working. And you do this by half pressing the camera, the shutter, and if the aperture changes in a room, that is basically telling you the light meter is reacting and it's working. If you see no change in the aperture in the shutter, if it remains very small, then it's not working, and leave well alone. That's a really easy check, and in my experience, and I've come across a lot of these, they either work or they don't work, and the key thing is often that the selenium meter. I've used them a lot. They are a great travel camera. I did once take, in 1983, I took one on a interrailing trip when I was 18, and by the end of the trip the lens was a little bit loose, and my dad took it to a camera repairer who said this looks like it's been on a bicycle in Greece, and it had. As I said, I've had quite a few of these. I've put a film through this one, and there was a little bit of an issue I felt on the metering, but it was still a joy to use. And as I said, that joy to use is the fact it's completely, although it's a manual camera, you don't have to think about anything. You just match the zone appropriately, as I said, in the viewfinder. There's no batteries to worry about at all. At the end of the film, you simply press this button at the bottom and you wind the film back. So you must wind the film manually back when you have finished with it. As I said, they continued to make them until 1984. They've then followed with a whole range of plastic trips which are in appearance very, very different, but the thing about all the trips were they were aimed at the photographer who didn't want to think too hard, and they are aimed at good, basic but sharp compact camera. The lens on here is a very good Zuiko 40mm 2.8 lens. It's very much of the Zeiss Tessa design, so you've got a really good lens on there. Well, the other thing to watch is if there's not enough light, the shutter just won't work, and you still get a little red indicator in the window. Occasionally that doesn't work, but the rest of the camera can do. There's been a renaissance of these cameras. They are quite popular now. Back in about the year 2000, you could easily pick them up in a charity shop for a £5. Those days are long since gone. They easily go for £50 to £100. There's a lot of sellers on eBay selling them as refurb, and I think they are refurbed, but it depends on the person who's buying it how refurb it actually is. You get them in a lot of fancy colours. I think it's a great camera to use. If you haven't used the Olympus Trip, I would really recommend one. They are great cameras and they take great images. We will just have a look now at some of the images I've taken.
It really was the dullest of days when I tested this camera. However, you can see that these photos, although they are dull, as would be expected in the conditions, it was February, it was late in the afternoon, it was probably about 5 o'clock, not that far from going dark. And yet, as I said, the Zuka lens is a great lens, and it's moderately fast at 2.8. And you don't have to think about this camera. All you have to do is look for a suitable subject matter, compose your shot, and take your shot. Yes, it's not particularly suitable for close-ups or if you wanted to do telephoto shots, but if you want a general compact camera that doesn't take batteries and a classic design, then the Olympus Trip is it. Thanks for watching. Bye for now.